stretch your legs. So now we go into the most nerdy part of today. This is where we are going to talk about the standards and the interpretation, application, and testability of standard. So we have a European standard 301549 with the presumed conformance of the Web Accessibility Directive in Annex A. And in this annex, there is a lot of reference to the Web Accessibility, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, sorry, where we have also understanding documents and other technical documentation supporting both the public sector bodies, the suppliers, the testers, and the monitoring agencies on how to understand and apply the requirements. But in the EN standard, there's also more than 30 requirements in Annex A only that goes beyond WCAG, that is on top of WCAG or just different than WCAG. So many stakeholders have struggled with this for a long time. We hear from many monitoring agencies, of course, but also the public sector bodies and all the subject matter experts and members of IAAP who need to figure out how are we actually going to handle these requirements. And there is no where to go to understand what the truth is. And many member states, or an increasing number of member states, are now creating documentation on how they think this should be done. And they may, of course, be perfect, but they are not the same in the different countries. And this is really contrary to the idea of the legislature of harmonization, as we heard June talk about earlier today. So this is a real problem. And in order to try to bridge this, IAAP has created a series of workshops where we let people with different perspectives on this work together, and in order to see if we, with discussion and a consensus-making process, could maybe reach some kind of idea of how to produce an understanding document for these requirements. Yesterday we had the third of this series, and we also have a small volunteer group of experts who are committed to drive this forward. And we have two of the facilitators of the workshop with us on stage now, and they are also part of this volunteer group. So we will present, or they will present, the highlights of a full day of breakout sessions and discussions. So it's going to be very condensed, but hopefully we will show a little bit about the problems, the possible solutions, or at least discussion points that we have touched on, and then of course leave room for questions. And because this is so technical, we will take the questions after each requirement. So stay awake and listen to distinguished panelists. And now something else is happening here. Detlev Fischer and Peter Kemeny, please introduce yourself first.
Yeah, hello, my name is Detlev Fischer. I'm Managing Director of DIAS GmbH, a small accessibility consulting and testing organization in Hamburg, in Germany. And I was one of the conveners of yesterday's workshop. So Peter and I are going to, would you want to introduce yourself first? Okay, Peter will introduce himself in a minute. We'll just take turns so that you're not getting bored by someone talking too long. And I hope to get through this quickly so that we have time for discussion. One of the requirements we discussed is 7.1.4 caption characteristics. Just to quickly remind you, it says if information communication technology displays captions, it shall also provide a way of adapting these captions to individual requirements, so users can change that. Unless captions are so-called open captions, so they cannot be changed. It's just kind of burned in, basically like an image. I didn't do anything. Okay, so examples are background and foreground colors, font size, font type, opacity of the captions, and so on. So that's the basic requirement. I don't know why this doesn't work. Or it's just a delay in moving forward, maybe. So why is it relevant, or what does it apply to? It's relevant for all video players embedded in ICT. So that's your common YouTube or Vimeo videos, for example. It's also relevant for the native video element in HTML. And as I said, it relates to closed captions only. Those are those captions which you can turn on, basically. You may not see them, but you may turn them on. There may also be different languages and so on. Open captions are excluded, and that's one of the things where we come to in a second. This doesn't really work. Okay, now it does. The target groups were a bit funny because the workshop found out that those which were listed as primary users are really more the secondary ones. Listed were usage without hearing and limited hearing as primary, but this type of requirement where you can extend the font size and the contrast and so on is really more something for people with low vision. And of course, you may have people with low hearing and low vision, but the primary use case is really making them better visible, increasing the size and so on. You move the slides. Okay. So what are the issues? As I said, embedded videos are covered. The question was in the normative requirement, what adaptations are really required? There's no specific list. There's just something in the requirement that says, a note says, a feature list like style and contrast and so on can contribute to meeting this requirement. That's a bit vague. Can contribute leaves it open whether it's a must or not. So, and the NXC then says, check that the ICT provides a way for the user to adapt to the display characteristics of captions to their individual requirements, but it also doesn't say what exactly needs to be changeable. Next one, please. So we have this already. No, okay. So what is possible to change? The workshop defined a few things that should be adaptable, and that's, first of all, font size, then also a change to at least one other font type, and to change the background and foreground color, and make sure that some combination of that has a contrast of 4.5 to 1. And also test if settings are possible to reach using assistive technology. This may actually be covered by another requirement, but it's also important, of course, that you know how to get to these settings. Next one, please. So we ended up with, or the workshop ended up with action items. The question was, how should open captions be regulated? So is there a possibility, for example, to rule them out and to say all captions need to be open captions, because open captions are the ones which you can convert, which you can turn into voice, for example, where you have transcripts. So they're much more usable and much more accessible than open captions. Did I say open captions? Yeah, sorry, I got it wrong. Closed captions are the ones which are adaptable. Open captions are the one which aren't. So it would be nice to rule out open captions, but there are also, of course, maybe also good reasons to have open captions. So how complex is it to find settings? That was discussed quite a bit. Should there be some requirements on how they should be placed? What can you make sure that the settings themselves are accessible? And there were also talking points about generated captions. That's not really under the remit of this requirement, but it's one that's missing at the moment. What do you do with automatically generated captions, which didn't exist when this was written? Because often you have captions which are very hard to understand because the way the software turns it into text creates lots of errors. And other things that would be nice to change would be text area size, character spacing, line height, font weight, and so on. But that's something that may not always be possible with common technology now, whereas the things that the group has picked, like font size and so, that's all things that you can change in things like YouTube video player. So it's doable today. That's it.
That's it. Okay. And I forgot that I need to have my computer to see what is happening online. But do we have any questions or comments from the audience here in the room while I open my computer? So we have one question about the settings. Maybe you can go back, whoever is doing the. So about the settings, you said that they should be clear or something like that. And the question is, could the settings be too intrusive? Isn't there features where that are self-explanatory instead? Isn't that a better way? So to balance, I guess the question is about the balance between providing instructions and making them be.
Well, I think settings would not normally require instructions. It's more like a conventional, often it's a conventional icon, like a little cog at the bottom of the video, and you open that and then you get more options. I know that there's some other requirements that all controls should be on the same level, which may contradict this, especially if you have many things to change, like not only font size and things, but also say different languages. You cannot fit everything into one line or the controls into one line underneath the video, especially in small viewport sizes. But in general, it's just a matter of knowing there are settings and then opening the menu and finding the settings. So I don't think you need extra explanations for that.
And the other question is, what does the contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1 come from? Is that from another standard?
No, it's from the same standard, basically. Or, I mean, the EN in the stuff that comes from WCAG obviously refers to WCAG, and the WCAG criterion 1.4.3, I think, is text contrast. That has this, for small text, it has this requirement to have a contrast of 4.1 to 1.
Any other questions or comments? Many in the audience here were at the workshop yesterday, so it's a little bit the same. And I think, yes, we do have a question or a comment from Mike. So we'll have a microphone coming your way. And please just state your name.
Yes, okay, Mike Luke. I'm actually leading the group that's updating the EN 301549 standard. Just to point out that, in fact, on this requirement and the other one that sort of got tangentially referred to, the spoken subtitles, both of those are under substantial review, and a lot of the issues that are raised are already being sort of addressed. But yeah, not necessarily everything. And certainly I've learned some good things by attending the workshop yesterday, which I think we can build into that updating as well. But so they'll be substantially updated by the time the next revision is published. So I have to update the advice on how to use them, or how to interpret them, because they will be different, basically. Yeah,
it's good to know.
But Mike, you also said yesterday that the workshop results from the previous workshops have been already included or not included in the
absolutely, yes. I mean, the previous workshop, the spoken subtitles, was something that caused a great deal of misunderstanding. And to be frank, as I say, those of us who had to put that into the standard right towards the end weren't very clear on it either. So that's been entirely clarified, I think. So the next release should solve that problem and some of the ones associated with this as well, I think. So yes, learned an awful lot from that last workshop, certainly.
Thank you, Mike. So if we don't have any more questions, I think we will move on to the next one, which maybe Peter, we don't really know if that works or not, but I think somebody's helping us with it. Yes.
Okay.
The previous slide.
Can we go back? Yes.
Can we move back one stage so we see the presentation of, thank you.
Yes, okay. So hello, everybody. I'm Peter Kemeny. I'm an accessibility expert. I am a CPEC and ADS a certified expert, so document specialist, but I cover all other areas as well. I'm here to talk about two requirements, which are about support services. And just a small thing, before we came on stage, Susanna asked the organizers to put water here for the speakers, because even seeing the water helps not to get dry mouth. And then we had the water, but out of reach, and that's actually worse than not seeing the water. And it's a bit like that with support services. Why? So when we need support services, we need help and we want them to work properly. So actually to have a support service that gives us information that is not actionable or not accessible is actually maybe worse than not having support services. So what is effective communication, the requirement effective communication about? It says that ICT support services shall accommodate the communication needs of individuals with disabilities, either directly or through a referral point. Basically, it says that support service should be able to communicate with all the users. Next slide, please. So, what are the issues we are having? Because the definition is quite clear and I think there's no problem there. But when it comes to the list of user needs, okay. When it comes to the list of user needs or the testing Annex C, it does present the same thing already in a limited way. And we say it shouldn't be limited. As I said, support service should be available for everybody. So when it comes to user needs, the primary target group listed is usage without hearing, usage with limited hearing, or without vocal capability, and secondary usage with limited cognition. So in our view, actually all user needs should be included, because if communication is not effective for all, communication is not effective. The other limitation is in Annex C when it comes about the description of testing. The testing procedure is quite clear-cut, but there's a note which says the provisions of any level of support for the communication needs of individuals with disabilities constitutes a pass of this requirement. So suppliers may wish to provide further information about the level of support that is provided to enable the adequacy and quality of the support to be judged. So again, any level is not the right level, because then if I provide some provisions, then it might exclude some user groups, or it might be not a level good enough. It can lead to frustration or useless support service, basically not effective communication. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, support that is not effectively communicated is not at all effective. The approach to this requirement should cover 3 stages or 3 aspects of the support. Access to service should be accessible. The way to the user to express itself themselves should be accessible, and the response should be understandable. It should be available to all users and regardless of impairments. We can claim that maybe there are some user groups that or situations where it's more required. For example, when you exchange personal information, you definitely want the communication to be effective. And if issues related to accessibility or disability might be, it can be argued that they are more crucial when it comes to effective communication. But as we said before, or I said before, it's always relevant and for everybody. Next slide, please. So we proposed an enhancement in the requirement to say that ICT support services must use more than one sensory channel provided, either directly or by referring to them to an appropriate resources. So the new element is one or use more than one sensory channel, which is an expression or terminology that comes from the IAA. And then the information about the modalities needs to be communicated to users. Next one, please. And 2 notes to that effective communication shall address technical, but also cognitive and understandability aspects, because they are a bit underrepresented in the standard. And where possible, the support service should respond in the same modality as chosen by the user. Now, when it comes to testing, next slide. The second part might not be feasible to test, so it might not be feasible to test whether the response channel is the same as the user used. But for testing, we recommend to use a manual testing by reading the information that's provided or evaluating the communication that's provided by support services. And this testing should be provided, if possibly, with help of the users. And next slide, please. So the procedure is also pretty clear-cut as originally. Precondition, there is an ICT support service. Then the testing should look for the support service page on the web and then evaluate if the communication is effective or not. It passes the test if the support service communication is using modalities supporting more than one sensory channel. And in that case, we would consider it effective. Thank you. Questions?
Do we have any questions in the room? Yes, we have a question. Yes.
Hi, Shilpi Kapoor from Barrier Break India. So my question is, it yet feels very open-ended to me because it talks about more than one sensory channel. So let's take for assumption that I say I want communication with sign language interpretation as one sensory method. So what happens to the other users in that case? So for me, the confusion is when we say anything, more than one sensory method, are we yet limiting other user groups that might need access? Also, I think today, the way I see ICT support services is more, a lot of it is online, right? And, are we building in things like chatbots which have, sign language interpretation or have captions or transcripts within it? So that's why I find this yet limiting. If we're updating it, I think maybe a thought of how support services are going to really be provided might first have to be thought of.
So thank you. If I can just say that, so the work of this volunteer group and in the workshops, that is to make sure that we understand what's in the standard now, and then we cannot keep ourselves from also suggesting improvements because the standard is under review. But the real work is really to make sure that all stakeholders understand how to apply and interpret and test the existing standards. So what Peter was talking about in the end was kind of this needs to be refined, and we will send that to the committee, of course. But because this is not Mike's work, this is going to be a new standard that is happening right now. And I think so that's one thing. And I think to your point, quite a lot right now in the EN standard has to do with, I mean, the more than one sensory channel, that's from the European Accessibility Act. So that's kind of, it's not just invented. And quite a lot in this standard says that you need to provide an alternative. And it does not say that you need to provide all possible alternatives. And it clearly does not take into account that people can have more than one disability and so on. So there is a gap here. I agree with that. I think we all do. But what we try to do is not to reach for the stars, but rather say that our suggestions should be in line with what is already in the legislation and the standard. But I completely agree with you. This is limiting and we should try to avoid that. But thank you for the question. Now I kind of answered, but that was my group. So
yeah.
We have another question online here. What if the user cannot describe the issue? How much does the support service need to do then? Walk in someone else's shoes, etc.
Yes, that was the second point of how it should be effective and accessible. So the effective communication also includes to help the user to explain the issue, make it so, for example, if it's a user with a speech impediment, then they should be patient and wait until they get relevant information. If the user is not tech savvy, then they might need to help the user to exactly find out what the situation is. So that's why, and that's a very good question. And it came to the group that it's not only about how the support service speaks or talks or communicates, but it's also about the bidirectional communication. So it's important, and it's not in the testing procedure that much, but it's important. It's an important aspect. So we did raise that, and that's something that should be considered or we think should be considered if this point is reviewed.
Yes. So Alejandro, the mic is coming to you. It's magic.
Thank you. So if I understood well, you were discussing proposals that will be sent to the committee that will be preparing the new standard for support services?
Yes.
Okay. And did you discuss also whether there is room for specific requirements in the EN 301549 concerning support services about the ICT, or will you consider just making a reference to that other standard?
That is a question that is not in scope of what the workshop was doing, because that is something still discussed. We need to clarify what is in the EN and what are in the new standards, and that is kind of an ongoing work. I see you, Mike, but I will not give you the floor. The next, because we only have 5 minutes per person. So the next one is presented by Detlev, I think, or yeah.
Yeah, that was actually my workshop, or the one where I was in. It's about 12.1.1 accessibility and compatibility features. This is not the whole normative text because there are several notes in that which would be a bit tedious to read now, but the basic idea of this requirement is that if there is product documentation, and I make a artificial pause to let the think in that there is a requirement, there is product documentation, then list and explain any accessibility features of the site or app. And that includes, one of the notes says that includes built-in features and those that work with access to assistive technology. And also it mentions that the accessibility statement and help pages are both examples of the provision of product documentation. So all those public bodies who are required to publish accessibility statements, by default, they would be providing technical documentation. And since they do that, they will also have to list accessibility and compatibility features, or whatever they put in on their site. Okay, next one, please. Some examples to make that a bit more clear is, for example, author-provided custom color schemes, you know, these contrast switches, or you have a dark mode switch, style switches to change font size. They were quite popular, not so much anymore, maybe yet now. Third-party accessibility overlays, much hated, but still around and increasingly around. They would also be part of accessibility features. Custom keyboard commands, which you should then be able to change and remap, so it's not a single key that triggers the command, would also be in there. Function that creates simplified language versions, for example, which will be increasingly available through AI. They will be part of that, or read aloud functions that are quite common on some sites as well. Next, please. So when is it relevant or applicable? The relevance is mainly for users who want to understand what features do and how to activate them. They may not understand the controls, for example, or may want to check what is available on a site. And the target group could really be any user with disabilities, because there are quite different interaction modes and functional needs for which those accessibility features exist, like low vision, keyboard only, or cognitive disabilities. Next one, please. So some of the issues, I think the main problem is that users know where to look for documentation on accessibility features? I mean, one obvious place is to look in the accessibility statement, but people often do not know that this exists or what it means. So those people who need that documentation may not find it. So that's, I think, a crucial issue. And we come back to that in one of the points. The interesting thing about the precondition is that now we have product documentation is supplied to the ICT. So if there is nothing, then you can basically skip this requirement, which may not be the best thing, because you should always be able to find documentation on those features. Next, please. So one idea was, because it was so not always quite clear what counts as product documentation, we created a positive list. And that's, for example, the accessibility statement. It's also critical help pages, which are needed to successfully use a product. One example was, say, if there's a navigation app for blind users, and you cannot really start using it without having some instruction at the beginning. Keyboard shortcuts, also setting time, extending the time available to complete processes would be an interesting one. Or documentation on resetting an account password, for example, if there is documentation on that. Even though that is not an accessibility feature, it would count as product documentation. So one way to draw the line would be, is documentation an integral part of the app, or could it equally be supplied in some other way, like documentation on creating a tax rebate claim, for example, that could be in an app, but also outside the app. Next one, please. So some other talking points, I'm going very briefly to that. We talked about the possibility of providing in-context documentation that would be easier to find, but it was also clear that this would also be needed to be provided in some conventional place. That some features may clash with security requirements. It's not really part of this requirement, but was something that was discussed. Onboarding processes may help store individual user profiles. So there were some examples from the UK where basically within onboarding you are checked, where you're asked, do you have a disability? And they could store a profile for that. AI may become relevant, but the group thought it wasn't that relevant to this now. Also, it was clear that settings on the platform level should not be documented within an app, only those things that the app or that the web site provides itself. And when needed, we'd also need a provision of a documentation for accessibility features in third-party content, possibly by linking to that documentation. So finally, testing should detect all accessibility features and then check whether they are listed, for example, in the accessibility statement. That's not always easy because some things may be hidden or not easy to detect. But I think that's a general problem with testing, to find everything that's relevant. There's also the discussion whether some features might be self-explanatory or too trivial to actually document, where you think, is it really necessary to document a simple contrast switch? When you can click it, you change contrast, you click it again and change it back. And are all the features covered and explained? So that's though that was the thing, not all features need to be explained in the accessibility statement. There could be many, so you may want to keep the statement short and sweet and decide to have a separate page for those requirements. I think that's the final recommendation in the workshop, was to change the requirement in the sense that you don't have that precondition that there's documentation, but simply to say, if there are any accessibility features, they should be documented. Yeah, that's it.
Very good. We have a question from online saying, why not copy the requirement on error message when it comes to in context, in summary, etc.? So I think that's...
Well, I mean, there are requirements for error messages, that an error is identified, that the error message can be understood or makes sense. This is more about the accessibility feature, so it's not quite the same thing. So I'm not quite sure how to respond to that. And the in-context thing probably has drawbacks as well, because it may not be available for all modes. In some cases, say if you have a long press on a touch screen, you'd have to make sure that you also get that in some other way if you want to make that accessible. So it's not always easy. Can create noise, but I think I'm not quite sure whether I understand the question correctly.
Maybe to kind of recommend or require both in context where possible and summarizing. So just, I don't know.
Yeah,
maybe.
I don't think anyone would require in context. There has to be something, but I don't think I think it would go too far to require one particular way of providing that.
But it wasn't discussed in the group anyway. So
no,
that's
not really. No.
I mean, there are so many other things we could have discussed that we didn't. We have a question in the back, please.
Hi, Malin Hammarberg from Funka Foundation. I hope I misunderstood you, but did you say that people with disabilities, users with disabilities, was to answer a question if they had a disability on the onboarding?
Well, that was
it
was just one example of, I think it was called vulnerability disclosure from one participant from the UK, who described that in one of their services, I think it was from the context of health, but I'm not entirely sure.
Okay, because it's a privacy issue, I would say, and also if you don't want to answer that, are you not allowed to have the support documents then?
Well, I guess in that process, there would be a way to skip that question or to refuse to answer. It's just an option. If you want your disability taken into account for the provision of things, say you always get high contrast mode, right? If the site could do that and you're asked whether you want to communicate that need, then it's up to the user to do that or not to do that, I think.
Okay, I think somebody else was waving, but now I don't see the hand anymore. Did we have a question here? No. Okay, very good. So then let's move on to the last one. So because you are now the only thing preventing us from having lunch, Peter. Good luck. Good luck with keeping people's attention. We
Next
deliberately
slide,
took
please.
this before lunch to keep people awake and kind of eager. So I think we say next slide and hope for, yeah.
Thank you for being awake still. Last one is about accessible documentation. Again, it goes back to support services. It is about documentation provided by support services. And I would like to emphasize that because in the discussion, it was very easy to stray from that. So the requirement says, and it's a simplified version of the standard, that if support service provides documentation, it must be available in at least one accessible electronic format, either a web format, conforming to clause 9 of the standard, or a non-web format, basically document conforming to clause 10 of the standard. So again, if the support service provides a printed information, a printed documentation, they also have to provide it in an accessible electronic format. There are some notes to the requirements. One is that additional formats like Braille or easy-to-read documents can be provided as needed, but still you have to provide the accessible electronic format, and you can also provide non-accessible documentation, but you have to provide the accessible electronic format. So why is it relevant? Who needs it? Again, it goes back to when users need support service, it's a kind of a vulnerable situation. They might need it because they don't understand the process or they don't understand how to use the product, or the process is difficult for everybody, or they prefer to get a personalized direct help, or maybe there's information that's missing that's not published and they need that. Me personally, I don't like to use user instructions or use support services. So and my wife hates that, but when I do need it, then I really I'm in a vulnerable situation. It's a proud thing as well, but I need it to be accessible. I need it to be understandable. So that's kind of the requirement for all users. Any users might need it. It's kind of extension of the available information should be accessible. So this documentation should be accessible as well. And it is especially necessary if a procedure is complex or a service is complex for certain user groups or difficult to understand. And if some information is provided in an inaccessible format, then maybe the support service is to remediate that. Next slide, please. So with the identified issues are very basic. First, what is documentation? So there's a list of examples in the standard, and it lists call center, tech support, relay services. So it kind of dates back. It shows that the requirement dates back more than 10 years. We evolved as much more ways to provide support service. So is a phone call in itself? That's the old question. Is a support service, is a documentation? We would say not. Is a chat discussion support service documentation because it's written on the screen? It might be. But if there's a transcript sent afterwards, it definitely is. Oh, a disclaimer. This will be more questions than answers. Is an accessibility statement in general documentation, and can it be used by the support service? Yes, but it should be accessible anyhow. The next question, what is actually support service? So there was this list, and there's a kind of a difference again here between the requirement and And the testing requirements, the testing description, because in the requirements it says support services, in the testing part it says ICT support services, and it's a relevant difference because if I go to a bank and I ask in-person support, does this, and they give me a documentation, does this requirement apply? What we came up with is that one requirement for either defining something as a support service or a support service procedure, that it has to be on request. So if you go to a FAQ page or you do a Google search that gives you results, that's not support service and that's not support service communication. And in that sense, the feedback mechanism in the Web Accessibility Directive, it's also a support service, and if they provide documentation, it's in the scope of this requirement. Next one, please. Two more questions. What about third-party content? If a support service rarely might refer to a third-party website, we came to the conclusion that support service is an individual personalized service, so they have the possibility to choose what support to provide. The idea is to provide support, so it should be efficient, effective communication. The documentation should be accessible. So we would say that it's still their responsibility to provide an accessible version, accessible electronic format. And some might have noticed that the app requirements, so clause 11 is not listed in the requirements. So it required either a web format or a document format. And we kind of came up with an answer for why it is not listed there, because if you have a support service documentation provided within the app that you have to use within the app, then you would need to change screens, and it can be extremely difficult. So maybe that's why it's not an acceptable way of providing documentation. Okay, next slide, please. So the testing is not about the communication, effectiveness of the communication. We talked about it before, but it's about electronic documentation provided by the support service. And the testing method we recommend is to launch an individual request in any of the published support service channels, require a documentation in that because you might have an interaction which does not result in a documentation, and then test that against clause 9 or 10. And if you want to go a bit beyond, maybe you should test all the service, all the support channels. Next slide, please. So what is the test? Preconditions: documentation should be provided by the support service. The procedure is 2 steps. Is there documentation in electronic format? If not, then it fails. And if there is, then does any of the versions provided meet clause 9 or 10? And it should be thoroughly checked. So both of these needs to be passed. And if we have time for just 2 comments more, next slide. 2 interesting questions that came up. What if the tool that the support service uses is not able to provide accessible format of a documentation? So it's kind of the legacy question. Should that be at least a temporary excluding factor? And the other one is, if it's a personalized service and the user discloses their user need, could it be enough to provide for the relevant user need? Because it's only that user using this support service. So if, for example, screen reader user says that I need a screen reader appropriate version, then would it be enough to adjust the format of the documentation to that? It's kind of an open question. And that was the work of our group. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we did have very good discussions, and we are leaving this with a lot of open questions still, and that is that leads me into one of the questions from online. So, or 2 questions: how can I contribute to this work, and will the results be published? And it's yes on both. We'd be happy to invite people to the next workshops, of course, and you can always contact me or Detlev or Peter or Malin. And we will make sure that we have information about that when we send out the survey or information that we send out after this event on how you can get involved in the work that we are doing. So with that, we have to wrap up. Unfortunately, I won't give you any questions, Peter, because it's now lunchtime and that is important. So for everyone in the room, the lunch will be served in the back where we had coffee before. And for everyone online, please have a little bit of good lunch and take care of yourselves until we meet again 1:45 Central European time. Thank you very much, Peter, Detlev, and everyone who contributed to the work yesterday and all the other facilitators. And thank you for being here with us today. Thank you.